examples. For instance, a man of more than 40. He had been awarded the Estonian Cross of Freedom. He went with his son. They set an example for us. When I was young, he had been to our school telling us stories about the War of Independence. In autumn of 1941, 6 security battalions, so-called Eastern battalions, and 6 police battalions were formed. In the winter battles that followed, it turned out that they would have to display their courage at the front. As autumn arrived in Estonia, the units of the resistance were replaced by a new self-defense force. Eventually, it would consist of 37,000 men. The new occupying power confiscated all so-called property of the Soviet Union, everything that had been nationalized during the Red Year. Farmers were merely granted use of their land. Enterprises went into the hands of the Germans. Farms had compulsory norms. A townsman, an Estonian, received a ration of 240 grams of bread and 35 grams of meat daily. Industrial goods were unavailable, even with a special purchase permit. Everything was put into the service of the German wartime economy. Farmers brought milk, and I had to be out there every day. I had long working days, and it was good to be at work. I had butter there, I won't deny it, that we packaged. The foreman would say that I was mismanaging my milk. He'd ask how come I distributed more milk than my documents allowed, but I was like that. I knew who had children in their families, and I always poured an extra drop. We received a fair amount of bread, even though it was rationed, and even some meat, but I remember that it was not much. But still, we did receive some meat.
Aga ma mäletan ka kui aga seda oli üsna vähekene küll, aga natukene liha sai ka ikka.
The Germans formed Ostland, the eastern region made up of the occupied Baltic countries and Byelorussia. Its administration included an Estonian General Commissariat headed by the SA General Litzman. In September, an indigenous civil administration was established, headed by Director General Hjalmar Mäe. Dual mechanisms of government meant German supervision. Greater Germany had plans for New Europe, but all the way to the very end it was unclear what lay in store for the Estonian people. Their destiny was supposed to depend on their contribution to the war effort. Stories about Greater Estonia envisaged the resettlement of Estonians to the east beyond Lake Peipus. From January 1942 onwards, young people from the Baltic countries were recruited to Germany for civilian service. They said this was the first phase of Germanizing the young. Meanwhile, Estonian men who had been taken to Russia were suffering in units called labor battalions. In 1942, Red Army units consisting of Estonians were formed. The battles of Veliki Luki would cost the Estonian Rifle Corps about half of its strength. All able-bodied and healthy men were screened. He wrote their names down. An army unit consisting of Estonians was being formed, and we were asked if we wanted to go. Well, who wouldn't have? Of course we wanted to, in order to stay alive. You would have been dead the next day if you had continued to stay in the conditions they had us living in. In the battles near Veliki Luki, a bigger troop of Estonian men were dragooned into the Red Army in 1941. In March of 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill concluded the Atlantic Charter, providing guarantees of pre-war borders. The Soviet Union joined in September. However, at the Tehran Conference at the end of 1943, the Allies promised Stalin the borders of 41, thereby also ceding the Baltic states to him. Nothing is being left behind that could be useful to the enemy. On the 14th of January 1944, the Red Army seized the initiative on the Leningrad-Novgorod front, and within a week's time the Germans began to retreat in panic. On February 2nd, the Red Army crossed the frozen ice of the Narva River in Estonia. This is one of the planned withdrawal movements, the practical importance of which even our enemy knows. Convoys are on their way through Narva in a completely orderly fashion. Thousands of civilians are joining them. A post moved forward on the bank of the Narva River. The High Command of the German Army planned to retreat quickly from Estonia to the Väina River line. Leader of the Estonian Home Administration, Dr. Mäe, announced a general mobilization. With the approval of the military command, Hjalmar Mäe called up all men born between 1904 and 1923 for military service. To do so in an occupied country was a violation of international law. Even earlier, men had been pressed into German service, but these efforts hadn't provided the needed manpower. Now, in this situation of great danger, former Prime Minister Jüri Uluots also lent his support to the mobilization in a radio broadcast. Thousands of new combatants joined in the fight against the encroaching Soviet forces. Imminent danger galvanized 3 times more men than needed, 45,000 in all. Fresh units filled the breach at the crumbling front at the decisive moment. The men fought to prevent a second Soviet occupation. They were afraid it would imperil the entire Estonian nation. German grenadiers, along with Estonian volunteers, are repelling the attack of the Soviet troops. Riigiküla was taken back on the 24th of February. Siivertsi, Vepsküla, and Vaasa were left. They constituted a Soviet bridgehead. There were minefields ahead. You couldn't simply proceed. You had to force your way in somewhere and enter into a trench. It was up to us to go forward with bayonets and hand grenades. Männik, the first man into the trenches of Riigiküla, cleaned them out with hand grenades. A step ahead and around the next corner, then a burst of fire, then forward and around the next corner again. The trenches were laid out in a zigzag fashion, ever onward with hand grenades. That's how you'd roll them up. Another Bolshevik assault was thwarted on the Narva front. We volunteered for the attack, but we didn't throw caution to the winds. We had healthy respect for our foes. Grenadiers are fighting in the Latvian and SS brigades. These units are repelling all attacks of the numerically superior Bolshevik forces in the Narva sector and are putting up successful resistance. Soviet positions that have been taken. I was given clean hospital garb in the morning. I'd already come back to consciousness and recovered my faculties. They put flowers on the table and whatnot. I only remember it vaguely. It was so long ago. I fell asleep at noon. When I opened my eyes, I saw high-ranking officials pushing in through the door. I didn't know that they would come to me, but they did. I remember Litzman being there, and Hausberger, and Mäe and Soodla. There were many of them.
Ma mäletan, et Litzman oli ja Hausberger oli ja see Mäe ja Soodla ja need kõik olid. No seal oli palju neid.
Violent battles were fought on the Narva front in early 1944. The Soviet Air Force bombed Estonian towns, with Tallinn coming under very serious attack on March the 9th. The people's fighting spirit was high, even though it was obvious that Estonia's future was grim. The movement for the restoration of independence gained momentum. Underground resistance groups had been formed. They were in touch with Estonian politicians in exile in Sweden. Ribbentrop had discussed autonomy for Estonia as early as 1943. The Estonians decided to pursue independence instead. On the 23rd of March 1944, the resistance groups formed the National Committee of the Republic of Estonia, headed by Karel Lidak. They wanted to re-establish the Republic. A wave of arrests followed in April. Almost 230 prominent Estonians were jailed. The activities of the National Committee weren't stepped up until July, when a diplomatic